The golden digits on the tablet screen didn't just blink. They seemed to bleed, hemorrhaging zeros, until the figure at the bottom of the Hallberg Global Ledger settled into a hollow, terrifying $0. Victor Hallberg's lungs seized, as if the oxygen in his executive suite had been sucked out by a vacuum, his fingers trembling so violently that the gold-plated casing of the device rattled against his manicured nails. In the background, the rhythmic, high-pitched wail of sirens began to climb the sides of the glass skyscraper, a mechanical scream that perfectly mirrored the silent, agonizing howl tearing through Victor's soul. He was the king of the New York trade floor, a man whose name was synonymous with untouchable. But as he stared at that digital void, the reality of his total ego death crashed down with the weight of a collapsing star. "There must be a mistake," he wheezed, the sound of his own voice thin and pathetic against the backdrop of a distant explosion from the lower levels. "The servers, the blockchain, it's just a glitch." But as he looked up, the hope died in his throat. Across the room, framed by the flickering orange glow of the server room fire and the clinical blue of the emergency lights, sat Lillian. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't running. She was sitting in his high-backed leather throne, her pregnant silhouette a sharp, immovable pillar of calm amidst the swirling ash and flying sparks. She raised a delicate porcelain cup to her lips, the steam from her tea rising in a slow, elegant curl that mocked the chaotic smoke billowing behind her. In that moment, Victor realized the fire wasn't an accident, and the $0 wasn't a glitch. They were the final punctuation marks in a sentence Lillian had started writing the moment he broke her heart. Victor lunged toward the desk, his knees buckling. "Lillian, do something. Call the security detail. The offshore accounts, they're being drained in real time. Everything I built, everything we are, it's burning." He reached for the internal landline, his movements frantic and uncoordinated, like a drowning man clawing at the surface of the water. He didn't see the yellow legal seizure tape already being stretched across his mahogany doors by men in dark suits he didn't recognize. He only saw the red flashing alerts on every monitor in the room. ASSETS frozen. Liquidation complete. Empire foreclosed. Lillian set the teacup down on the saucer with a soft, final clack. The sound was louder than the sirens. "You keep saying everything we are, Victor," she said, her voice a cool, melodic blade that sliced through his panic. She smoothed the silk of her dress over her protruding belly, her expression one of smug, terrifying serenity. "But you made it very clear at midnight that there is no we. You told me I was a burden. You told me I was dead weight on your ascent to greatness, so I decided to lighten your load." Victor froze, the phone receiver halfway to his ear. The memory hit him like a physical blow, the rain lashing against the penthouse windows at midnight, the way he had gripped Lillian's arm and shoved her toward the elevator, laughing as he told her his new mistress understood the Hallberg vision better than a pregnant housewife ever could. He had watched the elevator doors close on her tear-streaked face, feeling a surge of predatory power. He was free. He was the king. Now the king was shivering in a room that smelled of scorched paper and ruin. "What did you do?" he whispered, his eyes darting from her calm face to the $0 on the screen. "Lillian, that money is protected by the highest encryption in the world. No one could bypass the Sunset Protocol except the person who wrote the code," Lillian interrupted, her smirk widening into something sharp and predatory. "You always were so fond of telling the press that you were the genius behind the algorithms, Victor. You lied so often you actually started to believe it. But while you were out at galas and hotel rooms, I was the one building the walls of this fortress. And because I built them, I knew exactly which brick to pull to make the whole thing bury you alive." She stood up slowly, her movements graceful despite the weight of her pregnancy. She walked toward him, the light from the window hitting her face in a way that gave her a divine, almost vengeful glow. Outside, the first light of morning was beginning to gray the sky, revealing the chaos on the streets below. Fire trucks, federal vehicles, and news vans were swarming the building like ants on a carcass. Victor backed away, his heels catching on the plush carpet. "You're crazy. They'll arrest you too. You're my wife. You're tied to these assets." Lillian laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "Am I? Check the filing dates, Victor. I filed for a legal separation and an asset partition 6 months ago. You would have known that if you'd bothered to read the boring, legal updates I sent to your inbox. You were too busy signing off on your mistress's jewelry invoices to notice that you were signing away your power of attorney to a blind trust controlled entirely by me." She leaned in close, her eyes locking onto his with a cold blue intensity that made his skin crawl. "At midnight, you threw me out like trash. You thought I would go to a hotel and cry. You thought I would beg for a settlement." She reached out and plucked the gold-plated tablet from his shaking hands. With a flick of her thumb, she authorized one final transaction. The $0 didn't change, but a new notification popped up. Ownership transferred. "By morning," she whispered, her breath warm against his cold, sweat-beaded ear, "I didn't just want a settlement, I wanted the throne. And as of 5 seconds ago, Victor, you aren't just broke, you're a trespasser in my office." The heavy mahogany doors burst open. The men in suits, federal marshals, marched in, their faces grim. They didn't look at Lillian, they walked straight toward Victor, whose knees finally gave out, sending him collapsing onto the floor in a heap of expensive wool and shattered pride. "Victor Hallberg," the lead agent barked, reaching for his handcuffs. "You're under arrest for grand larceny, racketeering, and securities fraud." Victor looked up at Lillian, his mouth hanging open in a silent, pathetic scream of realization. He looked at her belly, the child he had called a burden, and then back at her cold, triumphant smile. Lillian didn't offer him a hand. She didn't even offer him a look of pity. She simply picked up her tea, walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, and watched the sun rise over the city she now owned, leaving her husband to be dragged away through the ashes of the empire he thought was his. The sunset protocol was complete. The night was over, and for Victor Hallberg, the sun would never rise again. To understand the true scale of the Hallberg Empire's collapse, one had to understand that Victor Hallberg was never the foundation of the building. He was merely the gold leaf applied to the spire to catch the sun. As the federal marshals dragged Victor toward the service elevator, his heels scuffing the marble floors he had once strutted across like a god, Lillian remained by the window. She watched the dust motes dance in the morning light, her mind drifting back to the 3 years of silence that had preceded this morning's symphony of destruction. To the world, Lillian was the graceful accessory, the quiet, glowing wife who stood 2 steps behind Victor at every press conference, her hand resting on his arm as he took credit for the Hallberg algorithm that had revolutionized high-frequency trading. In reality, Victor couldn't even explain how the algorithm worked. The story of the Hallberg Empire didn't start in a boardroom or a penthouse. It started in a cramped, 2-bedroom apartment in Queens, where younger Lillian sat hunched over a laptop until her eyes bled red, writing the proprietary code that would eventually move billions of dollars across the globe in the blink of an eye. Victor had been the one with the look, the square jaw, the silver-tongued charisma, and the utter lack of conscience required to sell a dream to a shark. He was the face, Lillian was the brain, and for a long time she had been content with that arrangement. She had loved him, and in her love, she had allowed her own brilliance to be swallowed by his shadow. Every major acquisition, every genius pivot in the market, and every defensive maneuver that had saved the firm from the 2024 crash had been Lillian's doing. She would spend 16 hours a day analyzing data streams, identifying the microscopic fractures in the global economy before they became chasms. Then, she would condense her findings into 3 simple talking points for Victor. He would memorize them, walk into the boardroom, and deliver them with such unearned confidence that the board members would practically weep with admiration. "I've done it again," he would boast over dinner, swirling a glass of vintage Bordeaux while Lillian sat across from him, her fingers still cramping from the keyboard. "My gut just told me the yen was going to slip. You should really pay more attention to the markets, Lil. It's a rush you'll never understand." Lillian would just smile, a small, tight secret of a smile, and nod. She didn't need the applause, she needed the stability, or so she thought. The shift began slowly, like a hairline fracture in a dam. As the empire grew, Victor's ego began to mutate. He started believing his own press releases. He stopped asking Lillian for her input and started giving her orders. He began to view her not as his partner or the architect of his wealth, but as a domestic fixture, something as reliable and invisible as the HVAC system in their $40 million penthouse. The board wants a more dynamic image for the company, Victor had told her 6 months ago, not looking up from his phone as he dressed for a gala she hadn't been invited to. They think it's better if I appear as a bachelor/visionary, you know, the lone wolf, having a pregnant wife at these events. It complicates the brand. It looks a bit traditional, doesn't it? That was the night the Sunset Protocol was born. Lillian had realized then that Victor wasn't just taking the credit. He was preparing to erase her entirely. He was a man who viewed people as depreciating assets. Now that she was carrying his heir, she had reached the peak of her utility to him, and he was ready to write her off, to make room for a newer model. He didn't realize that the very system he used to monitor his wealth was a cage she had built around him, one line of code at a time. While Victor spent his afternoons in hotel rooms with a 24-year-old brand consultant named Chloe, Lillian sat in the shadows of the home office. Her pregnancy, which Victor saw as a physical limitation, was her greatest cover. He assumed her baby brain made her soft and distracted. He didn't realize she was using that time to create a shadow ledger. She began by rerouting the intellectual property rights of the Hallberg algorithm. Through a series of nested shell companies based in jurisdictions Victor couldn't even find on a map, she slowly drained the Hallberg name of its value. Every time Victor signed a document she put in front of him, usually while he was distracted by a text from Chloe, he was unknowingly deconstructing his own fortress. She moved the deeds to the secondary properties into a trust for their unborn child. She moved the liquid cash into accounts tied to her own biometric data. She was the architect, and she was deciding that the building was no longer up to code. The irony was that Victor could have stopped it at any time if he had simply looked at the data. But Victor didn't know how to read data. He knew how to read teleprompters. He was so blinded by the volumetric lighting of his own fame that he couldn't see the woman in the shadows systematically removing the bolts from his floorboards. "You're lucky to have me, Lil," he had said just last week, tossing his jacket onto the chair she had bought with her own dividends. "Without my name, you're just another woman in a nice dress. Remember that." She did remember. She remembered every dismissive comment, every forgotten anniversary, and every time he had used her brilliance to bail himself out of a legal jam, only to tell the lawyers he had handled it personally. Standing now in the wreckage of his office, Lillian felt the baby kick, a sharp, strong movement that felt like an applause. The fire in the server room was being contained, but the fire in the markets was just beginning. The Hallberg name was now toxic, a radioactive brand associated with the largest financial fraud in a decade, but the Hallberg name wasn't hers. Her maiden name, Fairchild, was clean. Her assets were insulated. She looked down at the empty chair behind the desk. For years, she had let him sit there because she thought she loved the man he used to be. She had been the ghost in the machine, the invisible hand that guided the market, the architect who stayed off the blueprints. But the sun was up now. The shadows were gone. Lillian walked over to the desk and picked up the gold-plated tablet Victor had dropped. She didn't look at the $0. She swiped to a different app, a private, encrypted portal. The balance, there was a number so large it would have made Victor's heart stop. She wasn't the wife of a mogul anymore. She was the mogul. And as she watched the last of the smoke clear, she realized that the empire hadn't actually burned. It had just changed owners. The sky over Manhattan was the color of a fresh bruise, a swirling vortex of charcoal and violet that wept a relentless, freezing rain. Inside the Hallberg penthouse, the atmosphere was even more suffocating. The air-conditioned chill of the 81st floor felt like the inside of a meat locker, and the silence was so heavy it felt as though the very walls were leaning in, waiting for the first strike. It was exactly midnight. Lillian stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her hand resting protectively over the sharp curve of her 8-month pregnancy. She watched the reflection of the room in the glass. Behind her, Victor was packing. He wasn't the polished, charismatic CEO the world saw on the cover of Forbes. He was a man possessed by a frantic, jagged energy. He had been drinking, the amber liquid in his crystal glass sloshing against the ice with a rhythmic chime clink that sounded like a funeral bell. "I'm tired of the pretension, Lillian," Victor spat, his voice cutting through the stillness like a jagged blade. I'm tired of coming home to a partner who looks at me like I'm a science project. I'm tired of the weight of this domesticity. Lillian didn't turn around. The weight you're referring to, Victor, is your son, and the domesticity is the life we built together, the life that allowed you to become the man you are. Victor let out a harsh, barking laugh that held no humor. The man I am? I'm a god in this city, Lillian, and gods don't need anchors, they need muses, they need fire. He stopped packing and stared at the back of her head, his eyes narrowed with a cruel, newfound clarity. I've realized that you aren't the fire. You're the damp cloth trying to put it out. You've become boring, predictable, heavy. Lillian finally turned. The blue light of the storm outside illuminated the stark paleness of her face. Is that what you call Chloe? Fire? She's a 24-year-old social climber who thinks a diversified portfolio is a collection of different colored handbags. She doesn't love you, Victor. She loves the shadow you cast. At the mention of Chloe's name, Victor's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He slammed his glass down on a marble side table, the crystal shattering and sending shards flying across the designer rug. Don't you dare speak her name. Chloe sees me. She sees the visionary, not the bank account. She's everything you stopped being the moment you decided that being a mother was more important than being my wife. I am both, Lillian said, her voice dropping to a whisper that was far more terrifying than his shouting. I have carried your secrets, your scandals, and now your child. I have been the invisible architect of your every success. You wouldn't even know how to log into your own private servers without the cheat sheets I leave on your desk. Enough, Victor roared. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his shadow looming over her like a predator. He reached out and grabbed her by the upper arm, his fingers digging into the expensive silk of her robe. His grip was cold, clinical, and devoid of any lingering affection. I'm done with the lectures. I'm done with the invisible hand. I've already moved her things into the guest suite. She's coming over tonight. Now. Lillian felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. You're bringing your mistress into our home while I'm in this condition? Victor, think about what you're doing. This is a PR nightmare, if nothing else. There is no our home anymore, Victor hissed, his face inches from hers. He smelled of expensive scotch and betrayal. I've spent the last 3 hours talking to my lawyers. This penthouse is owned by Hallberg Holdings. I am Hallberg Holdings. You are a guest who has overstayed her welcome. And since you're so fond of your independence and your intellect, I think it's time you put them to the test. He began dragging her toward the foyer. Lillian stumbled, her hand clutching her stomach as she tried to maintain her balance. The sheer physical aggression of the act felt like a rupture in reality. This was the man she had loved, the man she had built a kingdom for, and he was treating her like a piece of faulty equipment being hauled to the scrap heap. Victor, stop, you're hurting me, she cried out, her voice finally breaking. You're a burden, Lillian, a dead weight, Victor shouted, his ego fueled by the intoxicating high of his own cruelty. He reached the massive, hand-carved oak front doors and threw them open. The hallway of the 81st floor was silent, lit by dim, amber sconces that made the space feel like a gilded tomb. With a final, violent shove, Victor pushed his pregnant wife out into the corridor. Lillian gasped as her feet hit the cold marble. She gripped the doorframe to keep from falling, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and a burgeoning, icy resolve. She looked back at him, this man who thought he was a king, and saw only a small, hollow boy playing with matches. You have exactly 10 seconds to leave this floor, Victor said, his voice trembling with a dark, manic energy. If you're still here when the elevator arrives, I'll have security remove you as a trespasser. Your accounts are being frozen as we speak. Your credit cards, cancelled. You're nothing without my name, Lillian. You're a ghost. Now go haunt someone else. You're making a mistake, Victor, Lillian said, her voice regaining its terrifyingly calm edge. She stood up straight, smoothing her robe, her eyes locking onto his with a gaze that should have burned him where he stood. A mistake you won't survive. I'm the one with the crown, Lil. I'm the one with the empire, Victor sneered. Now get out before I have you dragged out. He grabbed the heavy brass handle and slammed the door. The sound echoed through the hallway like a gunshot, final and absolute. Lillian stood in the silence, the only sound the muffled thrum of the building's ventilation and the distant rumble of thunder. She was alone, she was penniless. She was 8 months pregnant, standing in a hallway at midnight while the rain lashed against the windows of a world that had just turned its back on her. A single tear escaped her eye, trailing down her cheek like a bead of mercury. She reached up and wiped it away, her fingers steady. She didn't look at the door. She didn't bang on the wood or beg for re-entry. Instead, she reached into the hidden pocket of her robe and pulled out a small, unremarkable burner phone. She looked at the screen, the blue light reflecting in the cold, hard diamonds of her eyes. She dialed a number she had memorized months ago, a number that bypassed every firewall, every legal barrier, and every human guard Victor thought he owned. The line picked up on the first ring. "It's me," Lillian said, her voice as cold as the Atlantic. "He just closed the door. Everything is in place. Initiate the sunset protocol. By the time the sun comes up, I want there to be nothing left of the Hallberg name but ash." She turned and walked toward the elevator, her stride purposeful and rhythmic. Behind her, inside the penthouse, Victor was pouring another drink, toasting to his freedom. He didn't know that with that one slam of the door, he hadn't just evicted his wife. He had signed the death warrant for his empire. The elevator ride down from the 81st floor felt like a descent into the underworld. The mirrored walls of the lift, polished to a surgical sheen, reflected a woman Victor Hallberg no longer recognized, and a woman Lillian was only just beginning to meet. As the floor numbers flickered in a descending red blur, the physical sensation of the betrayal settled into her bones, cold and heavy as lead. When the doors slid open into the grand marble lobby, the night porter started to rise from his desk, a greeting forming on his lips. But one look at Lillian, her silk robe damp with the humidity of the storm, her hand over her pregnant belly, her eyes 2 frozen lakes, and he froze. She didn't look at him. She didn't ask for a taxi or a phone. She simply walked through the revolving glass doors and stepped into the teeth of the midnight storm. The rain was an assault. It wasn't the gentle, cinematic drizzle of a romance. It was a freezing, torrential downpour that soaked through her thin silk in seconds, plastering the fabric to her skin. The wind whipped around the corners of the concrete canyons, howling like a wounded animal. Lillian stood on the sidewalk of Park Avenue, the water rushing over her expensive leather slippers, feeling the absolute weight of her isolation. For a single, agonizing minute, the heartbreak won. The image of Victor's face, contorted with that ugly, primal sneer as he shoved her out, played on a loop behind her eyelids. She had given him her youth, her intellect, and her silence. She had built the very ground he stood on, only for him to kick her off the edge. A sob rose in her throat, hot and jagged, threatening to shatter the mask of her composure. She felt the baby kick, a frantic, rhythmic thrumming, as if her child could feel the cold seeping into her marrow. "It's just us now," she whispered into the wind, her voice swallowed by the thunder. But then the heartbreak began to calcify. The heat of her sadness didn't dissipate, it compressed, turning from a soft, weeping wound into a hard, diamond-sharp resolve. The betrayal was the catalyst, but the sunset protocol was the solution. She reached into the pocket of her soaked robe and gripped the burner phone. This wasn't just a device, it was a detonator. She began to walk, her footsteps splashing through the puddles that mirrored the flickering neon signs of the city. She didn't head for a hotel, she didn't head for a friend's house. She headed for the one place Victor never visited, the one place he considered, beneath the Hallberg brand, a small, nondescript server farm in a basement in Chelsea, held under a name so obscure even the IRS hadn't flagged it. As she walked, she wasn't just a woman in the rain, she was a ghost moving through a machine. With every block she covered, she began the mental checklist of the demolition. In her mind, she could see the Hallberg global architecture, a sprawling, interconnected web of servers, offshore accounts, and legal loopholes. Step 1, the liquidity drain. She tapped a sequence into the burner phone as she ducked under a subway overhang. Somewhere in the Cayman Islands, a series of dormant accounts woke up. These weren't accounts Victor knew about. They were the buffer accounts Lillian had created to hide his tax indiscretions years ago. Now they were the vacuum. Like a digital siphon, they began pulling the liquid capital from the Hallberg operating accounts. $10 million, $50 million. $100 million. The numbers moved in silence, a subterranean river of gold flowing away from the king and into the hands of the ghost. Step 2, the IP erasure. The rain lashed at her face, but she didn't feel the cold anymore. She felt the electricity of the kill. The Hallberg algorithm, the genius code that Victor claimed to have written in a fever dream of inspiration, was protected by a 24-character master key. Victor thought the key was his birthday followed by his mistress's initials. He didn't know that Lillian had installed a logic bomb in the core directory 3 months ago. One command from her phone, and the algorithm wouldn't just stop working. It would delete its own source code, leaving Victor's trading floor with nothing but a series of file not found errors. Lillian stopped in front of a rusted iron gate leading to basement stairs. She was shivering now, her lips tinged with blue, but her hand was steady as she swiped the burner phone over an encrypted NFC reader hidden behind a loose brick. The gate hummed and clicked open. As she descended the stairs, the sound of the rain faded, replaced by the low-frequency thrum of cooling fans and the rhythmic blinking of green and amber LEDs. This was her cathedral. This was the place where the architect in the shadows had spent her baby brain afternoons while Victor was out making a spectacle of himself. She sat down at a workstation in the corner of the room, the monitors bathing her wet, pale face in a cold, cyan glow. Her pregnancy made it difficult to hunch over the keyboard, so she leaned back, her fingers flying across the keys with a muscle memory that transcended the physical trauma of the night. "You called me dead weight, Victor," she muttered, the clacking of the mechanical keyboard filling the room like a flurry of staccato gunfire. "So let's see how well you fly without your wings." She initiated the final phase of the Sunset Protocol, the public execution. She didn't just want his money, she wanted his dignity. She began uploading the black box files to every major news outlet's encrypted tip line. The files contained everything: the emails Victor sent to his mistress using company funds, the fraudulent ledger he used to inflate the Hallberg stock price, and the recordings of him mocking his own board of directors. But the crowning achievement was the legal partition. With a final, decisive strike of the Enter key, Lillian triggered the transfer of the Hallberg real estate portfolio, including the very penthouse Victor was currently sleeping in, into a blind trust. The beneficiary of that trust wasn't Lillian. It was the Fairchild Maternal Health Foundation, a nonprofit she had set up in her maiden name. By the time the sun hit the windows of the skyscraper on Park Avenue, Victor wouldn't just be broke. He would be a tenant of the woman he had thrown out in the rain. Lillian leaned back, her eyes reflecting the scrolling lines of green code that signaled the total collapse of the Hallberg empire. The heartbreak was gone now, replaced by a profound, icy clarity. She looked down at her belly and felt a gentle movement, a soft nudge against her ribs. "Almost time," she whispered. She stood up, leaving the damp silk robe on the chair. In the locker she had prepared weeks ago. She found a dry, oversized sweater and a pair of leggings. She dressed slowly, methodically, shedding the last remnants of the wife of Victor, like a snake shedding a dead skin. She climbed back up the stairs and emerged into the gray light of the pre-dawn. The rain had slowed to a mist, and the city was beginning to wake up, unaware that its financial heart had just been cut out. Lillian walked toward a waiting black car, not a Hallberg car, but one she had hired using a private account. As she slid into the back seat, she looked up at the silhouette of the Hallberg Tower in the distance. "Good morning, Victor," she said, a small, smug smirk finally touching her lips. "I hope you enjoyed the view while it lasted, because today the sun doesn't rise for you, it rises for me." The car pulled away, disappearing into the mist, leaving the Sunset Protocol to do its work. By morning, the empire would be burning, and the architect would be the only one left with the keys to the city. To understand the precision of the morning's destruction, one had to look past the smoke and into the silent, invisible machinery Lillian had been building for years. While Victor had been busy being the face of the company, the loud, boisterous king of Wall Street, who dominated every room with his expensive cologne and unearned bravado, Lillian had been the ghost. She was the architect who knew where every structural support was hidden, and more importantly, exactly how much weight each one could take before it snapped. The ghost in the machine wasn't a sudden invention born of a single night's rage. It was a masterpiece of cold, calculated preparation. It was a montage of 1,000 small, overlooked moments where Victor's arrogance had provided Lillian with the tools for his own undoing. It began 18 months ago, in the quiet hours of the morning, when Victor was usually dead to the world, snoring off a night of excess. Lillian would sit in the dim glow of her home office, her fingers dancing across the keys of a laptop that was never connected to the Hallberg global network. This was the birth of the Fairchild Ledger. Victor viewed the company as a monolithic block of power, but Lillian saw it for what it truly was, a collection of digital permissions. She began the offshore migration. Using her deep understanding of the Hallberg algorithm's internal architecture, she created a series of data siphons. These were microscopic lines of code that diverted a fraction of a percent of every transaction into a dormant entity called Alethea Holdings. To the system, these looked like standard server maintenance fees or rounded-off currency conversion errors. To Victor, who couldn't balance a checkbook without a team of 4 accountants, these figures were invisible. But over 18 months, those fractions of a percent had grown into a mountain of liquid capital that Victor could no longer touch. But the plan wasn't just about money, it was about the people Victor had trampled on his way to the top. Lillian knew that a king is only as strong as the people who serve him, and Victor treated his staff like disposable furniture. Lillian's preparations included a secret loyalty protocol. She spent months identifying the invisible pillars, the executive assistants who knew where the bodies were buried, the IT specialists who saw the illicit downloads, and the paralegals who drafted the hush-money agreements Victor thought were ironclad. One by one, she had approached them in the shadows. There was Marcus, the head of cybersecurity, whose daughter's medical bills Victor had refused to cover despite the company's record profits. Lillian had paid them in full, anonymously, from her private trust. There was Sarah, the lead accountant, who had been passed over for a promotion in favor of one of Victor's drinking buddies. Lillian had offered her a golden parachute that Victor couldn't claw back. When the walls come down, Lillian had told them in a series of encrypted messages, the Hallberg name will be ash, but your futures will be safe. All I need is for you to look the other way when the Sunset Protocol pings your servers. They didn't just look the other way, they became her eyes and ears. They provided the legal traps that were now snapping shut around Victor's ankles. Sarah had helped Lillian document every instance of Victor's commingling of personal and corporate funds, the jewelry for Chloe, the private jets for his weekend benders, the offshore accounts he thought were his secret getaway fund. Lillian didn't just find these accounts, she re-indexed them. She changed the secondary authentication to her own biometric data, effectively locking Victor out of his own escape hatch while he was still inside the burning building. The technical execution of the ghost in the machine was a study in digital camouflage. Lillian had built a mirror network, a complete, functional replica of the Hallberg trading floor that ran in the background of the main system. For months, the trades Victor thought he was making were actually being filtered through Lillian's mirror. She was allowing him to see the gains he expected, while the actual assets were being quietly reallocated into the Fairchild Trust. It was a digital illusion of the highest order. Victor was playing a video game of his own life, thinking he was winning, while the real world was being sold out from under him. Even the legal seizure tape that now adorned the penthouse doors was a product of her foresight. Lillian had spent her leisure time drafting a series of self-executing contracts, smart contracts, stored on a private blockchain. These contracts were triggered by a single event, her physical removal from the penthouse. The moment Victor shoved her out the door, the burner phone in her pocket sent a signal that validated the breach of their prenuptial good faith clause, a clause she had buried in 80 pages of legalese that Victor had signed without reading because he was too busy checking his reflection in his gold-plated watch. The breach of that clause didn't just trigger a divorce, it triggered a total asset reversion. Every property, every patent, and every piece of art Victor thought he owned was instantly transferred to the maternal trust she had established for their child. By the time he went to bed at 1:00 a.m., he was technically a squatter in his own home. Lillian's preparation extended even to the mistress variable. She had known about Chloe long before Victor thought he was being clever. In fact, Lillian had been the one to suggest the agency that provided Chloe's brand consulting services. She had ensured that Chloe was exactly the kind of vapid, ego-stroking distraction Victor would fall for. She used Chloe as a heat sink, allowing Victor to vent his narcissism and distraction onto her while Lillian focused on the demolition. Chloe wasn't just a mistress. She was a diversionary tactic that kept Victor's eyes off the ledgers and on the lingerie invoices. As Lillian sat in the back of the car in the pre-dawn gray, she reviewed the final status reports on her phone. Marcus IT, servers locked, source code deleted. Sarah accounting, federal dossiers delivered. The ghost ledger, $1.2 billion, successfully transitioned. She looked at the city passing by. To anyone else, the Hallberg Tower was a monument to one man's greatness. To Lillian, it was a hollow shell, a theatrical set where the lead actor was about to find out the stage was made of paper. She had been a ghost for years, drifting through his life, fixing his mistakes, and absorbing his cruelty. But ghosts have a way of haunting the people who try to bury them. Victor had forgotten that the machine doesn't run on ego, it runs on logic, and Lillian was the only one who held the logic. She wasn't just the architect of the empire, she was the architect of its end. The preparation was over. The montage of her life as the invisible wife was ending, and the final act was beginning. Lillian closed the app on her phone and watched the first rays of the sun hit the top of the tower. It looked beautiful, glowing like a torch, but she knew better. It wasn't glowing, it was burning, and she was the one who had struck the match 18 months ago. While the city of New York lay in the deceptive stillness of the pre-dawn hours, the digital world was experiencing a silent, tectonic shift. Inside the Hallberg penthouse, Victor lay sprawled across his silk sheets, his breath heavy with the scent of expensive scotch and the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he had finally trimmed the dead weight from his life. He slept the deep, ignorant sleep of the condemned, unaware that at exactly 3:00 a.m. the Sunset Protocol had moved from its preparation phase into its terminal execution. In the high-rise apartments of the Hamptons and the sprawling estates of Connecticut, 14 encrypted tablets chimed simultaneously. These devices belonged to the board of directors of Hallberg Global, men and women who had spent a decade treating Victor like a golden calf, happy to ignore his erratic temperament as long as the dividends remained high. They woke to a nightmare. The dossiers appearing on their screens weren't just accusations, they were autopsies of Victor's integrity. Lillian had timed the delivery with surgical precision. At 3:00 a.m., the brain is at its most vulnerable, the sudden shock of adrenaline cutting through the haze of sleep to leave a person hyperfocused and terrified. As they swiped through the files, the directors didn't see the visionary CEO they had toasted at the last gala. They saw a criminal who had been using the company's infrastructure as a personal piggy bank and a shield for his most depraved impulses. The first domino was a folder labeled Project Icarus. It contained an exhaustive list of every time Victor had manipulated the Hallberg algorithm to artificially inflate the stock price before his own quarterly bonus evaluations. The data was undeniable, side-by-side comparisons of real market data and the mirrored numbers Victor had presented to the board. Lillian had provided the raw code, the timestamps, and the digital signature that proved the orders had come directly from Victor's private terminal. In a penthouse in the Upper East Side, Arthur Sterling, the board's elder statesman, felt his chest tighten. He looked at a spreadsheet detailing the $400 million liquidity gap Victor had created by rerouting company capital into offshore accounts to cover his gambling debts in Macau. The architect had even included the photos. Victor at a high-stakes table, surrounded by people the SEC had spent years trying to indict. The second domino fell with a sickening thud. The hush money ledger. This wasn't just about money, it was about the human wreckage Victor had left in his wake. Lillian had compiled every non-disclosure agreement Victor had forced upon junior employees, accompanied by the wire transfer receipts from the corporate miscellaneous expense account. The board members saw the names of young women they recognized, people who had resigned for personal reasons, only to disappear with a six-figure check and a shattered career. Lillian hadn't just exposed Victor's fraud, she had exposed the board's complicity. A final, unlabeled file at the bottom of the dossier contained a series of recorded board meetings. In them, Victor could be heard laughing about how easy it was to dangle a few points of growth in front of the directors to keep them from asking where the money was really going. He called them glorified rubber stamps and his well-paid lapdogs. The vengeance and justice trope was now in full swing. By 3:15 a.m., the silence of the night was broken by a frantic flurry of phone calls between the directors. The king they had served was no longer an asset, he was a radioactive liability. "We have to terminate him before the markets open," Arthur Sterling whispered into his phone, his voice shaking with a mix of fury and self-preservation. "If this gets to the feds before we act, we're all going down for negligence." He didn't know that Lillian had already sent the dossiers to the Department of Justice, the SEC, and the New York Times 2 minutes before the board received them. She wasn't giving them a chance to clean up the mess. She was giving them a front-row seat to the explosion. Back at the Chelsea server farm, Lillian sat in a clean, dry chair, watching the metadata of the board's activity. She could see which directors were opening which files. She saw the panic index rising as they realized the Sunset Protocol was an inescapable trap. She felt no pity. These were the men who had looked her in the eye at dinner parties for years, knowing Victor was cheating on her, knowing he was stealing from the firm, and choosing to stay silent because it was profitable. The power inversion was nearly complete. While Victor dreamt of his fresh start with Chloe, his legal standing was being erased bite by bite. Every minute that passed brought a new domino down. At 3:30 a.m., the Halberg Global Insurance carriers were notified of the fraud, triggering a clause that automatically froze the company's D&O, directors and officers, insurance. At 3:45 a.m., the major institutional investors began receiving sell alerts triggered by the sudden disappearance of the Halberg algorithm's source code. The most brutal domino, however, was personal. Lillian had included a file specifically for the board's legal counsel. It was the asset reversion contract Victor had unknowingly signed at midnight. It proved that, as of 12:01 a.m., Victor Halberg held zero equity in the company. He had effectively signed a confession and a resignation simultaneously. The ghost in the machine was now a reaper. Lillian looked at the clock. 4:00 a.m. In 4 hours, Victor would wake up. He would reach for his phone to check the morning futures, expecting to see his empire standing tall against the Manhattan skyline. He wouldn't find his empire. He would find a smoking crater and 1,000 legal seizure alerts. She leaned back, her hand resting on her stomach. The baby was quiet now, as if sensing the gravity of the shift. The cold walk through the rain was a distant memory, replaced by the warmth of a perfectly executed plan. She hadn't just burned his house down, she had waited until he was asleep inside, then dismantled the stairs and removed the fire extinguishers. The board members were now drafting the emergency press release, their fingers trembling as they tried to find a way to distance themselves from the man they had once called a genius. They were already discussing who would replace him. They didn't realize that Lillian didn't want the board's approval to lead. She didn't need their permission. By the time the final domino fell, the one that alerted the federal marshals to Victor's current location, Lillian was already closing her laptop. The night was her ally, and the silence was her weapon. "Sleep well, Victor," she whispered to the empty room, her eyes reflecting the cold, green glow of 1,000 successful executions. "The morning is coming, and you're going to hate the light." The dominoes were all down. The path was clear. The empire burning wasn't a possibility anymore, it was a mathematical certainty. And as the first hint of grey light touched the horizon, the architect prepared to step out of the shadows and watch the sun rise on a world where the name Halberg meant nothing at all. The sun rose over Manhattan not as a herald of a new day, but as a spotlight illuminating a crime scene. The golden light hit the glass of the Hallberg Tower, but instead of reflecting the glory of a billion-dollar legacy, it revealed the first cracks in a hollowed-out shell. Inside the penthouse, Victor Hallberg stirred. His head throbbed with the dull, rhythmic ache of a Scotch-induced hangover, and the air in the room felt strangely stagnant, as if the life support systems of the building had already begun to fail. He reached out a hand, expecting to feel the silk of Lillian's side of the bed, before the memory of midnight flooded back. He smirked, a jagged, ugly expression. He remembered the rain, the shove, and the satisfying thud of the door closing on his pregnant wife. He felt lighter, he felt powerful. Freedom, he muttered to the empty, silent room. He reached for his smartphone on the nightstand, the gold-plated device that served as his scepter. He expected the usual barrage of sycophantic emails, news alerts praising his latest, bold move, and perhaps a suggestive text from Chloe. Instead, the screen was a wall of red. Critical system failure, unauthorized data migration detected, account access suspended. Victor frowned, his thumb swiping frantically. Glitch, he hissed. He tried to log into his private banking app, the one that housed the Black Fund, his $200 million safety net. The app didn't even load. It simply flickered and died, replaced by a static image of a sunset. A cold trickle of sweat began to slide down the back of his neck. He sat up, the room spinning slightly. He pulled his laptop from the drawer, his fingers trembling as he typed his master password. Invalid CID and TILS. Impossible, he whispered. He tried again and again. On the fourth attempt, a window popped up. It wasn't a standard Windows prompt. It was a video file titled The Architect's Resignation. He clicked it. The screen stayed black for 3 seconds before Lillian's voice filled the room, not the soft, accommodating voice he was used to, but a cold, crystalline tone that sounded like ice breaking underfoot. At midnight, Victor, you decided I was dead weight. At 12:01 a.m., I decided you were obsolete. By the time you finish this video, you will realize that you didn't throw me out of your house. You threw yourself out of mine. The video ended, and the laptop screen went black, the hard drive emitting a faint, high-pitched whine as it began to melt its own circuitry. Victor lunged out of bed, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He ran to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city he thought he owned. Far below, on the street level, he saw them. Even from 80 stories up, the bright yellow of the legal seizure tape was unmistakable. It was being stretched across the main entrance of the Hallberg Tower. White vans with federal plates were swarming the plaza. He turned and grabbed the remote for the massive television embedded in the wall. Every news cycle was the same. The ticker at the bottom of the screen was a blur of catastrophe. HALBRG global collapses. Victor HALBRG sought for questioning. Board of DICTOIS, ISSUES, vote of no confidence. $1.2 billion VANISHES in overnight trading. No, Victor screamed, the sound echoing off the cold marble floors. No, I built this, it's mine. He scrambled to find his clothes, his hands shaking so violently he could barely button his shirt. He needed to get to the office. He needed to talk to Arthur Sterling. He needed to find Chloe. He grabbed his tablet, the last piece of tech that seemed to be functioning, and saw the notification that had been waiting for him since 3:00 a.m. It was a bank balance, a single digital line of text that served as his death warrant. Current balance, $0. Beneath it, in the memo line, was a single word, tips. The power inversion was no longer a theory, it was his physical reality. Victor ran to the penthouse door and yanked the handle. It didn't budge. The smart lock system, the one he had bragged was unhackable, was glowing red. He was locked in. He pounded on the wood, his fists bruising. Open the door, security, someone open this door. Outside, he heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots on the marble corridor. Not the polite, quiet steps of his security detail, but the disciplined, heavy tread of men with a purpose. Federal marshals, open up, a voice barked. Victor backed away, stumbling over a designer chair. He looked around his sanctuary and realized it was a cage. The art on the walls, The Picassos and the Warhols he had bought to show off his wealth now looked like witnesses to his execution. He looked at the tablet again. The $0 seemed to grow larger, mocking him. Suddenly, the lights in the penthouse flickered and died. The hum of the air conditioning cut out, leaving the room in a terrifying, oppressive silence. "The Empire Forecloses" wasn't just a headline, it was the sound of the power being cut to a man who had forgotten how to breathe without a machine. Through the windows, he saw a helicopter rising from the south. It bore the Fairchild logo, the maiden name of the woman he had discarded. It hovered for a moment, the downdraft rattling the glass of his bedroom before turning and heading toward the federal building. Victor fell to his knees. The morning of ash had arrived, and he was the only thing left to burn. He realized then that Lillian hadn't just taken his money, she had taken his identity. Without the Empire, Victor Hallberg was just a man in an expensive shirt, crying in the dark. The zero-value anchor was now the only weight he had left. He looked at the gold-plated tablet, the screen glowing in the shadows, and let out a long, shuddering breath. The sirens were closer now, a chorus of justice rising from the streets to claim the king of nothing. Lillian had told him at midnight that he wouldn't survive the mistake. She was wrong. He was surviving it, but the survival was the punishment. He would live to see his name scrubbed from the buildings. He would live to see his visionary algorithms revealed as her handiwork. He would live to be the man who threw away a queen and found himself in the mud. The door groaned under the weight of a battering ram. Victor closed his eyes, the smell of ozone and ash filling his lungs. The sunset protocol was over. The morning was here. And for the first time in his life, Victor Hallberg was exactly what he had called his wife. Dead weight. The sound of the battering ram against the penthouse door was a rhythmic, metallic heartbeat, the sound of the world finally forcing its way into Victor Hallberg's private delusion. He didn't wait for the hinges to snap. Driven by a primal, lizard-brain panic, Victor scrambled toward the service entrance, a hidden door disguised behind a silk-paneled wall that led to a private freight elevator. He was gasping, his lungs burning with the dry, stagnant air of a building whose soul had been surgically removed. He hit the descent button with a trembling thumb. To his shock, the elevator arrived instantly. The ghost in the machine was still getting him, though he was too blinded by terror to realize he was being funneled exactly where Lillian wanted him to go. As the lift plummeted toward the executive floors, Victor clutched his gold-plated tablet to his chest like a holy relic, staring at the $0 balance as if he could manifest a comma and a string of zeros through sheer force of will. "I can fix this," he hissed to his reflection in the brushed steel. "I'll get to the backup servers, I'll call in the favors, I'm Victor Hallberg." But the man in the mirror looked like a ghost. His hair was disheveled, his eyes were bloodshot, and the frantic sweat had turned his designer shirt into a translucent second skin. When the doors slid open on the 40th floor, the heart of the Hallberg Empire, he didn't find the bustling hive of activity he expected. He found a graveyard. The trading floor was silent. Hundreds of monitors, which usually flickered with the green and red pulse of global capital, were now static screens of flat, mocking blue. The air was thick with the smell of scorched plastic and the ozone of a massive electrical surge. It was the empire burning in digital form. Victor sprinted across the open floor, his leather shoes clicking loudly on the polished concrete. He headed for the double mahogany doors of his private office, the throne room where he had spent a decade playing God. He expected to find it empty, a place to hide until his lawyers could bridge the gap. Instead, he found the doors already wide open. The scene inside was a study in power inversion. Victor skidded to a halt, his chest heaving. The office was crawling with men in dark windbreakers, with federal agent stenciled in high-contrast yellow across their backs. They were methodically boxing up his files, tagging his furniture, and pulling the hard drives from his proprietary servers, but they weren't the focal point of the room. In the center of the chaos, sitting in the high-backed leather chair that Victor had commissioned from an Italian artisan, was Lillian. She was a vision of smug serenity. She had changed into a tailored slate-blue maternity suit that made her look like a piece of the sky, cool, distant, and untouchable. She was leaning back, one hand resting on the swell of her stomach, the other delicately holding a porcelain cup of tea. The contrast was devastating. Victor was a portrait of total ego death, covered in sweat and shame, while Lillian looked as though she were hosting a Sunday brunch in the middle of a war zone. "You're late, Victor," she said, her voice a calm, melodic chime that cut through the sound of shifting boxes. "The movers were beginning to think you lost your way." Victor's mouth worked, but no sound came out for a long moment. He looked at the agents, then back at his wife. "Lillian, what is this? Tell them to stop. Tell them there's been a mistake with the accounts. You can fix the code. I know you can." Lillian took a slow, deliberate sip of her tea, her eyes never leaving his. "There is no mistake, Victor. The code is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It's purifying the system. It's removing the corruption." "I'm the system," Victor roared, his desperation finally boiling over into a pathetic, impotent rage. He lunged toward the desk, but a large agent stepped into his path, his hand resting firmly on his holster. Victor stopped, trembling. "I built this. You're my wife. You're supposed to be on my side." "I was on your side for 10 years, Victor," Lillian replied, her voice dropping to that cold, crystalline register that made his skin crawl. "I was on your side when I wrote the algorithms that made you a billionaire. I was on your side when I covered up your first affair and your second and your fifth. I was on your side when I stayed in the shadows so you could feel like a giant." She stood up slowly, the agents moving aside to give her the floor. She walked around the desk Victor had used to sign her eviction notice just hours ago. "But at midnight," she continued, stopping just inches from him, "you decided that being a giant meant stepping on the person who built your pedestal. You called me dead weight. You threw me out in the rain like a broken toy. You forgot the most basic rule of architecture, Victor. You never, ever weaken the foundation while you're still living in the house." She reached out and plucked the tablet from his shaking hands. She glanced at the $0 on the screen and smiled, the winner's smirk that signaled total victory. "The federal team is here because I invited them," she whispered, leaning in so only he could hear her. "I provided the dossiers, I provided the encryption keys, I even provided the coffee. I'm not just the witness to your fall, Victor, I'm the executioner." "You'll go down with me," Victor hissed, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. "The company, your shares." "My shares were moved into the Fairchild Trust months ago," Lillian said, pulling a legal document from the desk and sliding it toward him. "It was the asset reversion contract. And as for the company, it doesn't exist anymore. Halberg Global is being liquidated to pay the victims of your fraud. But don't worry, the proprietary tech, the algorithm, the patents, they've all been acquired by a new firm, Fairchild Strategic." She patted her stomach gently. "Our son will have a very comfortable inheritance. But you don't even own the shirt you're wearing. It was bought with corporate funds, and as of 5 minutes ago, those funds have been seized." The lead agent stepped forward, pulling a pair of stainless steel handcuffs from his belt. The yellow caution tape of the law was closing in. "Victor Halberg," the agent said, "you are under arrest for securities fraud, money laundering, and grand larceny." Victor looked at Lillian, his face a mask of catastrophic realization. He looked for a spark of the woman who used to love him, the woman who would have done anything to protect him. He found only the cold blue light of a woman who had finally stepped out of the shadows and realized she liked the sun. "Lillian, please," he whimpered as the metal ratcheted shut around his wrists. "Think of the baby, he needs a father." Lillian picked up her teacup and turned back toward the window, watching the city wake up to the news of his ruin. "He'll have a father, Victor," she said, her voice reaching him from a vast, unreachable distance. "He'll have the memory of a man who served as a very important lesson, a lesson in why you should never underestimate the person who keeps your world turning." As the agents led the King of Wall Street away in his own office, Victor turned back for one last look. Lillian didn't even turn around. She was looking at the horizon. The architect, finally standing in the light of the empire she had reclaimed. The federal marshals paused near the threshold of the office, their hands firm on Victor's shoulders, allowing a final, jagged moment of silence to hang in the air. Victor was a broken man, his knees trembling within his bespoke trousers, his gaze fixed on the floor as if he could somehow find a trapdoor leading back to yesterday. But the final blow, the one that would strip away the very last layer of his vanity, was still waiting to be delivered. "Lillian," Victor rasped, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "How could you do this to me, to us, even if you hated me? How could you be so cold? Was it all a lie? Every year we spent together, was it just a calculation for you?" Lillian turned away from the window, the morning light framing her in a silhouette of absolute authority. She didn't look angry. Anger was a hot, impulsive emotion, and Lillian had moved beyond it into the realm of clinical precision. She looked at him with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a dying culture in a petri dish. "A calculation," she repeated, her voice echoing in the hollowed-out office. "No, Victor, for a long time it was love, but love is a living thing. It requires oxygen to survive. You choked the life out of it with every dismissive comment, every night you didn't come home, and every time you took my work and put your name on the masthead. I didn't start calculating until you started treating me like an asset that had reached its expiration date." She took a slow step toward him, her heels clicking on the floor like the ticking of a doomsday clock. "You thought you were being so clever, didn't you? The secret dinners, the hotel suites, the brand consultant who suddenly appeared in your life just when you felt you needed a fresh start." At the mention of Chloe, a spark of the old Victor flickered in his eyes, a desperate, pathetic hope. "Chloe, she's the only thing that was real. She's the only one who didn't want anything from me but me. You can take the money, Lillian. You can take the buildings, but you can't take the fact that someone actually chose me over the machine." Lillian paused, a small, pitying smile touching the corners of her lips. It was the winner's smirk in its most devastating form. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted handset, not the burner she had used for the Sunset Protocol, but a sleek, high-end device. She tapped a command and placed it on the desk between them. "Chloe," Lillian said to the phone, "you can come in now." The side door to the executive lounge, the private room where Victor had spent countless hours working with his mistress, swung open. Chloe stepped out. She wasn't wearing the tight, provocative dresses Victor favored. She was dressed in a sharp, professional blazer and slacks, her hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun. Her expression wasn't one of love or even guilt. It was the expression of an employee finishing a long, difficult shift. Victor's jaw dropped. "Chloe, baby, what are you doing? Tell her you're with me." Chloe didn't move toward him. Instead, she walked straight to Lillian and handed her a slim, silver flash drive. "That's the last of the audio logs from the penthouse, Lillian. Every confession, every fraudulent instruction he gave over the last 48 hours. It's all there." Victor felt the world tilt. The price of disposability was suddenly, agonizingly clear. What is this?" "This is Chloe," Lillian said, her voice dripping with a cold, rhythmic satisfaction. "Or rather, this is Special Agent Clea Rossi. She's a private forensic investigator I hired through a third-party firm 18 months ago. You see, Victor, I knew you would eventually look for a replacement. A man with your level of narcissism can't help himself, so I decided to provide you with one." Lillian walked over to Chloe and placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of psychological pillar solidarity that made Victor feel like he was disappearing into the carpet. "I knew your type, Victor," Lillian continued, her eyes locking onto his with a gaze that felt like a physical weight. "I knew you'd want someone young, someone seemingly vapid, someone who would make you feel like the sun and the moon. I drafted the character of Chloe to be your perfect distraction. I gave her the scripts. I told her which of your genius ideas to laugh at. I even picked out the perfume she wore because I knew it reminded you of the woman you thought you could never have." Victor's face went from pale to a sickly, mottled gray. The total ego death was complete. He realized that the one thing he thought was his own, his romantic conquest, his fire, was just another line of code written by the architect. He hadn't been a lover, he had been a mark. "Every time you whispered a secret to her," Lillian whispered, her voice a cold blue light in the shadows of his ruin, "she was recording it for me. Every time you bragged about how you were going to dump your boring wife and take the company private, I was listening. You didn't find a muse, Victor, you found a Trojan horse, and you invited her right into your bed." Clea, the woman formerly known as Chloe, looked at Victor with a flat, professional gaze. It wasn't personal, Mr. Hallberg. It was a job, and frankly, it was the most boring job of my career. Your ego is incredibly predictable." Victor let out a sound that was half sob, half choke. He looked at the two women, the wife he had discarded and the mistress who didn't exist, and realized he was completely, utterly alone. He had thrown away the only person who had ever actually cared for him to chase a phantom created by that very person to destroy him. "You're a monster," Victor wheezed, his last shred of dignity evaporating like mist in the morning sun. "No, Victor," Lillian replied, picking up her teacup for one last sip. "I'm an architect, and as I told you before, you should never have weakened the foundation. You thought people were disposable assets. You thought you could throw me away and just plug in a new model, but the new model was mine too." She nodded to the federal marshals. The legal seizure was moving into its final phase. "Take him away. He's taking up space in my office." As the agents hauled Victor toward the door, he didn't scream. He didn't fight. He just stared at Lillian, his eyes wide with the primal fear of a man who finally understands that he never truly existed. He was a character in her story, a placeholder in her empire, and the story had moved on without him. Lillian stood in the center of the room, the winner's smirk fading into a look of quiet, profound peace. The price of disposability had been paid in full. She turned back to the window, the sunlight finally washing away the last of the orange fire from the night. "Good work, Claire," Lillian said softly. "Check your account. The bonus has already been cleared." "Thank you, Lillian," Claire replied, heading for the door. "And congratulations on everything." Lillian didn't answer. She just looked out at the city, her hand on her belly, feeling the future growing within her. The Hallberg name was gone. The empire was hers. And for the first time in 10 years, the architect was finally free to build something that would never, ever burn. The heavy mahogany doors of the executive suite swung shut with a finality that echoed like the falling of a guillotine blade. In the hallway, the receding scuff of leather shoes and the rhythmic rattle of handcuffs marked the departure of the man who had once been the sun around which the city revolved. Victor Hallberg was gone, transitioned from a titan of industry to a mere case number in a federal docket. Within the office, the silence that followed was not empty. It was a living, breathing thing, the sound of a vacuum being filled by a much greater force. Lillian Hallberg, soon to be Lillian Fairchild once more, remained in the center of the room. She stood amidst the whirlwind of legal seizure activity, but she was no longer a part of the chaos. She was the eye of the storm. The federal agents continued their work, moving with a newfound, hushed reverence around her. They didn't see a grieving widow or a victimized wife. They saw the empress of industry who had dismantled a billion-dollar fortress from the inside out without raising her voice or breaking a sweat. She walked slowly toward the high-backed leather throne Victor had cherished. She didn't sit in it. Instead, she placed her hand on the headrest, feeling the cool, expensive hide under her palm. For years, she had stood behind this chair, whispering the logic that kept the empire upright while Victor preened for the cameras. Now, the chair was just a piece of furniture in a room she had reclaimed. With a gentle push, she sent the chair spinning, watching it rotate until it faced the windows. "The king is dead," she whispered to the empty air, her voice carrying the smug serenity of a woman who had seen the end of the world and decided she liked the view. The power inversion was absolute. Lillian moved to the floor-to-ceiling glass, her silhouette a sharp, immovable pillar against the backdrop of a waking Manhattan. Below, the city was a grid of light and movement, millions of people beginning their day, unaware that the tectonic plates of the financial world had shifted beneath them. The yellow, legal seizure tape still fluttered in the wind 80 stories down, a barrier that kept Victor's past from infecting her future. The pregnancy hook that had once been a source of Victor's derision now felt like her greatest strength. She felt a sharp, rhythmic kick against her ribs, the moral compass of her journey. This child would not be born into a house built on Victor's lies and fragile ego. He would be born into the Fairchild reign, a dynasty built on the cold, hard logic of the woman who had survived the midnight rain. She reached for her phone, the one connected to the new Fairchild strategic servers. The screen didn't show red alerts or desperate messages. It showed a cold blue stream of data. The markets were opening, and while the name Hallberg was being dragged through the mud of every news ticker, the Fairchild assets were climbing. She had successfully transitioned the load-bearing beams of the industry into her own hands. She wasn't just free of Victor. She was more powerful than he had ever dreamed of being, because her power was real, rooted in the code she had written and the alliances she had forged in the dark. She watched a news helicopter bank away from the building, its cameras likely capturing the image of her standing at the window. To the world, she was the mystery of the hour. To herself, she was finally visible. The invisible ghost had manifest. Lillian thought back to the midnight betrayal, the freezing rain, the shove, the sound of the elevator doors closing. In the span of a few hours, she had traveled from the lowest point of a human life to the absolute pinnacle of corporate dominance. The emotional arc was complete. The architect had finished her masterpiece. She took a deep breath, the air in the office now smelling of rain and new beginnings rather than ozone and scorched paper. She saw the first rays of the true morning sun hitting the spire of the Chrysler building, turning the steel into a spear of light. For the first time in 10 years, the sun wasn't a reminder of the work she had to do for someone else. It was a spotlight on the work she had done for herself. "Initiate the new reign," she said softly, though there was no one in the room to hear her. She didn't need a burner phone or a secret command anymore. The world was already listening. Lillian Fairchild turned away from the window, walking past the legal seizure team without a word. She headed for the private elevator, her stride purposeful and rhythmic. She didn't look at the empty desk. She didn't look at the shattered crystal on the floor. She looked only ahead, toward the doors that were now held open for her by men who understood exactly who held the keys. The empire burning was over. The ash had settled. And as Lillian stepped into the elevator and began her ascent to a life of her own making, the city below continued to hum, unaware that its new queen had finally arrived. The story concludes with a devastating legal and social purge. Victor Hallberg, stripped of his name and his fortune, is led away in silence, his $0 tablet the only legacy he has left. The legal outcome is swift. Federal investigators, guided by Lillian's flawless dossiers, dismantle the last of Victor's fraudulent shell companies. Lillian, meanwhile, stands at the helm of Fairchild Strategic, the woman who found her voice in the silence of a midnight storm and used it to command a new era of industry. The narrator emphasizes a chillingly beautiful lesson. The person you treat as disposable is often the one holding your world together. Victor, total ego death, serves as a warning that power built on the backs of others is nothing more than a house of cards waiting for a change in the wind. Lillian's transformation proves that brilliance doesn't need a spotlight to be lethal. It only needs a plan and the patience to wait for the sun to go down. If you felt the chill of that midnight rain and the heat of the empire burning, hit that like button and share this story with someone who needs to know that karma isn't just a concept, it's a calculation. Subscribe and hit the bell to ensure you never miss a tale of cathartic revenge and power inversion. Leave a comment below. What would you do if you realized the person you underestimated held the keys to your entire life? Stay sharp, because in the world of high-stakes justice, the quietest move is often the one that ends the game.